The sun was setting over the Indonesian islands, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. For the Anderson family, this was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. They had saved for 3 years to make this happen, and now here they were, surrounded by crystal blue waters and untouched beaches that looked like postcards come to life. Rebecca Anderson had been dreaming about this trip since she was a little girl. Now 28 years old and working as a marine biologist, she finally convinced her parents and younger brother to join her for a week of island hopping. She wanted to show them the world she had fallen in love with through her studies. The coral reefs, the tidal pools, the way the ocean held mysteries that science was only beginning to understand. Her mother, Helen, was a high school teacher who usually spent her summers catching up on sleep and gardening. Her father, Tom, ran a small hardware store back in Portland and hadn't taken a real vacation in over a decade. Her brother Michael was 23 and had just graduated from college. He was the cautious one in the family, always double-checking the travel insurance and keeping copies of their passports in 3 different places. The first 3 days of the trip had been perfect. They had snorkeled in waters so clear you could see 30 feet down. They had eaten fresh fish grilled on the beach by local fishermen. They had laughed more as a family than they had in years. Helen kept saying it was like having her kids back the way they used to be, before life got complicated and everyone got too busy. On the 4th day, they hired a local guide to take them to a smaller, uninhabited island. The guide, a weathered fisherman named Booty, told them this place was special. Not many tourists came here because it was further out and the currents could be tricky, but the beaches were pristine and the tidal pools were full of life. They anchored the boat in a protected cove and waded to shore. The beach was empty except for seabirds and hermit crabs scuttling across the sand. Rebecca was immediately drawn to the far end of the beach where a rocky outcrop jutted into the water. She had her camera, her waterproof notebook, and that look in her eyes that her family knew well. When Rebecca was in research mode, the rest of the world faded away. "Don't go too far," Tom called out as she headed toward the rocks. "I'll be back in an hour," Rebecca shouted over her shoulder, already focused on the tide pools ahead. Helen spread out a blanket and unpacked their lunch. Michael helped Booty set up a small shade canopy. The sun was getting hot and they were content to relax while Rebecca did her thing. She had always been like this, even as a child. Give her a beach and she would spend hours examining shells, watching crabs, building elaborate sandcastles with moats and channels for the water. An hour passed quickly. Helen dozed in the shade while Tom and Michael explored the shallow water near the boat. When Helen woke up, she noticed the sun had shifted. She checked her watch. An hour and a half now. "Tom, should we go check on Rebecca?" Tom shaded his eyes and looked down the beach. The rocky outcrop blocked their view of the other side. "Yeah, let's go get her. Lunch is getting warm anyway." The 3 of them walked down the beach calling Rebecca's name. When they rounded the rocks, they found themselves looking at another stretch of beach, even more beautiful than the first, but Rebecca wasn't there. Maybe she went further, Michael suggested, though something in his voice sounded uncertain. They walked the length of the beach, calling louder now. Nothing, just the sound of waves and birds. Then Tom spotted something near the waterline. Rebecca's camera bag sitting on a flat rock above the tide. Her notebook was still inside, dry and protected. Her water bottle was there too. Helen's hands started shaking. "Where is she? Rebecca, Rebecca!" They found footprints in the wet sand leading from the rocks down into the surf. The tide was coming in, washing away the prints even as they looked at them. Tom waded into the water, shouting his daughter's name until his voice went hoarse. Michael ran back to get Booty, who immediately radioed for help. What happened next became a blur of uniformed people, boats, helicopters, and questions repeated in different languages. The Indonesian Coast Guard arrived within 2 hours. By nightfall, there were 6 vessels searching the waters around the island. Divers went down to check the rocks and reef. A helicopter with thermal imaging equipment flew grid patterns over the ocean. The Anderson family spent that night on a Coast Guard vessel, wrapped in emergency blankets, unable to sleep. Helen couldn't stop crying. Tom sat rigid, staring at the dark water, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Michael kept replaying the afternoon in his mind, wondering if they should have checked on her sooner, wondering if 15 minutes would have made a difference. The search continued for days. International rescue teams joined the effort. Every fishing village along the coast was contacted. Flyers with Rebecca's photo were posted everywhere, The American embassy sent representatives. Local volunteers searched the islands on foot in case she had somehow made it to shore somewhere. The Andersons refused to leave Indonesia. They rented a small room in a coastal town and spent every day coordinating search efforts, following up on tips, talking to anyone who might have seen something. Helen stopped sleeping more than 2 hours a night. Tom lost 20 pounds. Michael made hundreds of phone calls, managing the family business from half a world away, trying to hold everything together. After 3 months, the official search was called off. The authorities sat down with the family and explained gently that the ocean currents in that area were powerful. The chances of survival after this much time were, statistically speaking, impossible. They were so sorry. They had done everything they could. The family flew home to Portland 6 months after Rebecca disappeared. Her status was changed to lost at sea, presumed deceased. They held a memorial service, but there was no body to bury. Helen couldn't bring herself to pack up Rebecca's room. Tom stopped going to the hardware store regularly. Michael dropped out of the graduate program he had just started. The not knowing was the hardest part. Every time the phone rang, every time there was a knock at the door, there was a split second of hope that maybe somehow there would be news. But months turned into years, and the hope became a wound that wouldn't heal. 11 years would pass before that phone would ring with the call that would change everything. The first year was the hardest. Helen would wake up every morning and forget for just a moment that Rebecca was gone. Then reality would crash back in and she would have to live through losing her daughter all over again. She stopped teaching for a while. The thought of standing in front of a classroom full of young people, some of them the same age Rebecca had been, felt impossible. The living room became a place nobody wanted to enter. Helen had covered one entire wall with photos of Rebecca. Baby pictures, school photos, pictures from family vacations. Rebecca's high school diploma hung in a frame. Her college degree. Articles she had published in marine biology journals. It was like a museum dedicated to a life cut short, and walking through that room felt like walking through grief made visible. Tom dealt with it differently. He went back to work at the hardware store, but he wasn't really there. Customers would ask him questions and he would stare at them blankly for several seconds before answering. He stopped making jokes. He stopped asking people about their projects. He just rang up their purchases and went through the motions of a life that felt hollow. At night, he would sit at the computer for hours, searching for anything new about missing persons cases in Indonesia. He had bookmarked dozens of websites, joined online forums for families of missing people, set up alerts for any news from that region. He sent emails to private investigators even though they had already spent most of their savings hiring people who found nothing. He couldn't accept it, couldn't let go. Michael moved back home after dropping out of graduate school. He told himself it was to help his parents, but the truth was he couldn't function anywhere else. He would have panic attacks in grocery stores, convinced he saw Rebecca in every young woman with dark hair. He stopped answering calls from friends who wanted to check on him. What was he supposed to say? That he was the one who suggested the trip? That he should have gone with her to those tide pools? He started taking long walks at night, sometimes not coming home until 3 or 4 in the morning. Helen would hear the front door open and close and know it was Michael, restless with guilt that wasn't his to carry but that he carried anyway. The second year was different but not better. The sharp edges of grief dulled into something heavier and more permanent. It wasn't the constant crying anymore. It was the empty chair at Thanksgiving. It was Helen buying Rebecca's favorite coffee creamer out of habit and then staring at it in the cart, realizing her mistake. It was Tom driving past the college Rebecca had attended and having to pull over because he couldn't see through his tears. People stopped asking how they were doing. At first, the casseroles and sympathy cards had flooded in, but people move on. They have their own lives, their own problems. The Andersons understood this, but it made the isolation feel deeper. The world had continued spinning while theirs had stopped. By the 3rd year, they had to make decisions. Helen went back to teaching part-time. She needed the structure, needed to be around people even if she felt like she was watching life from behind glass. Tom hired a manager for the hardware store because he couldn't be trusted to show up consistently anymore. Michael got a job at a coffee shop, something simple that didn't require much thought. They started going to a support group for families of missing persons. There were others like them. living in the terrible space between hope and acceptance. A father whose son had vanished during a hiking trip, a wife whose husband had disappeared after leaving work one evening, a mother whose daughter had never returned from spring break. They all carried the same weight, the same unanswerable questions. The years crawled by. 4 years. 5. 6. Michael started seeing a therapist who helped him understand that he wasn't responsible for Rebecca's disappearance, even if his brain insisted on replaying that day endlessly. He met someone, a woman named Claire who worked at the bookstore next to the coffee shop. She was patient with his bad days, with the way he sometimes went quiet and distant when something reminded him of his sister. 7 years. 8. Helen finally took down some of the photos in the living room. Not all of them. She couldn't do that, but enough that the room felt less like a shrine and more like a place where a family lived with their memories, instead of being buried by them. Tom still searched online sometimes, but not every night anymore. Just on bad days or on Rebecca's birthday or around the anniversary, 9 years, 10, Michael proposed to Claire. They had a small wedding, and it was both joyful and heartbreaking because Rebecca should have been there. Helen cried through the entire ceremony and later she apologized, but Claire just hugged her and said she understood. Tom walked Michael down the aisle and gave a toast that mentioned Rebecca, saying she would have loved Claire. And everyone raised their glasses with tears in their eyes. Tom started a foundation for families of missing persons. It wasn't big, just something small to help people who were going through what they had gone through, help with travel expenses for search efforts, connections to resources and support groups, someone to talk to who actually understood. It gave him purpose, something to do with all the energy he had spent searching for Rebecca. By the 11th year, they had learned to live with it. Not to get over it, because you don't get over losing a child, but to exist alongside the grief instead of drowning in it. They had good days and bad days. They talked about Rebecca sometimes, shared memories, laughed at stories from when she was young and determined and full of life. In August, on the 11th anniversary of the day Rebecca vanished, they held a small memorial service at the waterfront in Portland. Just family and close friends. They released paper lanterns into the water at sunset, watching them float away carrying their wishes and their love. Helen had written a letter to Rebecca that she didn't read aloud, just folded up and tucked into her lantern. Tom stood with his arm around her, both of them watching the lights drift away. Michael held Claire's hand and thought about how life moves forward, even when you don't want it to. How you can carry loss and still find moments of peace. How his sister would have wanted them to keep living, to find happiness where they could. None of them knew that in a small island village thousands of miles away, someone was preparing to tell a story about a woman who had come from the sea. None of them knew that their phones would ring in a few days with news that would turn their world upside down all over again. For now, they stood together and watched the lanterns disappear into the evening, believing they were saying goodbye forever. Daniel Chen had been planning this documentary for 2 years. He was an independent filmmaker who specialized in stories about remote communities, cultures that existed on the edges of the modern world. His last film had been about nomadic herders in Mongolia. Before that, a group of fishermen in Alaska who still used century-old techniques passed down through generations. This project was different. He wanted to document the Bajo people, sometimes called sea nomads, who lived in the waters around eastern Indonesia. They were a tribe that spent most of their lives on boats or in villages built on stilts over the ocean. Children learned to swim before they could walk. Adults could hold their breath for remarkable amounts of time, diving deep without any equipment. Getting permission to visit them had taken months of negotiations with local authorities and tribal leaders. These communities were protective of their privacy, and for good reason. Too many outsiders had come with cameras and left with stories that turned the Bajo into curiosities rather than people. Daniel had promised something different. He wanted to show their daily lives, their traditions, their relationship with the ocean that was both their home and their livelihood. In late August, he finally got the approval he needed. A local guide connected him with a tribal elder named Pak Hassan, who agreed to let Daniel visit their settlement. The village was on a small island called Pulau Tersembunyi, which translated to Hidden Island. It wasn't on most maps. The only way to get there was by boat, and you needed to know the channels through the reef or you would tear your hull apart. Daniel arrived on a humid morning, his camera equipment packed in waterproof cases. The village was beautiful in a way that made him understand why the Bajo had chosen this life. Wooden houses on stilts stretched out over turquoise water. Children jumped from platforms, splashing and laughing. Women sat on porches, mending fishing nets, while men worked on boats below. Pak Hassan was in his 70s, his skin darkened and lined by a lifetime under the sun. He spoke some Indonesian that Daniel could understand with help from his guide, and he seemed genuinely interested in sharing his culture with someone who approached it with respect. They spent the first day just talking, drinking tea, watching the village go about its daily routines. Daniel asked about fishing techniques, about the history of the Bajo people, about how climate change was affecting their way of life. Pak Hassan answered thoughtfully, sometimes pausing to find the right words to explain concepts that didn't translate easily. Late in the afternoon, as the light was getting soft and golden, Pak Hassan mentioned something that caught Daniel's attention. "We had a stranger come once," he said, "a woman from the sea." Daniel thought he had misunderstood. His Indonesian wasn't perfect. "From the sea?" he asked. Pak Hassan nodded. "Yes, many years ago now. 11, maybe 12 years. There was a big storm, very dangerous. The waves were so high they came over the houses. The next morning we found her on the beach. A foreign woman, pale skin, almost dead." Daniel put down his tea. "A foreign woman? What happened to her?" "We brought her to the village. She was badly hurt. Hit her head. We thought she would die, but our healer, she is very skilled." Slowly the woman got stronger. But her mind, it was broken. She could not remember anything. Not her name, not where she came from, nothing. "Is she still here?" Daniel asked, his filmmaker instincts suddenly alert. Pak Hassan smiled. "Yes, she is one of us now. We call her Dewi Laut, it means sea goddess. She lives in the forest now, prefers the quiet." Daniel couldn't believe what he was hearing. A foreign woman, washed ashore 11 years ago, living with a remote tribe. This was exactly the kind of story that could make his documentary something special. But more than that, he felt a pull of something deeper. This woman, whoever she was, she had people somewhere who probably thought she was dead. "Could I meet her?" Daniel asked carefully. "I promise I will be respectful." Pak Hassan considered this for a long moment. "I will ask her. If she wants to meet you, we will arrange it." That night, Daniel lay awake in the small guest house the village had prepared for him. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the water lap against the stilts below. A woman from the sea. It sounded like a myth, but Pak Hassan had said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating a simple truth. The next morning, Pak Hassan told him that Dewi Laut had agreed to meet him. They walked through the village and then up a narrow path into the jungle that covered the interior of the island. The air was thick and humid, filled with the sounds of insects and birds. After about 20 minutes, they came to a clearing where a traditional house stood, built in the style of the Bajo but on land rather than over water. A woman emerged from the doorway, and Daniel felt his breath catch. She wore the traditional sarong and tunic of the Bajo women. Her hair long and sun-bleached, her skin deeply tanned, but her features were unmistakably Western. High cheekbones, a straight nose, eyes that were blue or green. He couldn't quite tell in the dappled sunlight. She looked at him with curiosity but also caution, the way someone might look at a strange animal they weren't sure about. When she spoke, it was in the Bajo language directed at Pak Hassan. He translated for Daniel. "She asks why you want to see her." Daniel chose his words carefully. "I'm making a film about the Bajo people. Pak Hassan told me your story. I thought maybe you would want help finding out where you came from." The woman listened to the translation, her expression unreadable. Then she said something short and turned to go back inside. Daniel thought he had offended her, but she returned a moment later holding something small in her hand. She held it out to him. It was a locket, old and tarnished, the silver turned almost black. The chain was broken. She gestured for him to open it. Inside was a photograph, faded and damaged by water but still visible. A family of 4 standing on a beach. A man, a woman, 2 younger people who looked like their children. One of them, a young woman with dark hair pulled back, looked remarkably like the woman standing in front of him, despite the years and the sun damage. The woman pointed to the young woman in the photo, then to herself. Then she shrugged, a gesture that needed no translation. "This is all I know." Daniel's mind was racing. This locket could be the key to everything. If he could figure out who this family was, he could reunite them. He looked at the woman, at her weathered hands holding this one precious connection to a past she couldn't remember. "Can I take a picture of this?" he asked. "I might be able to find your family." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. Perhaps both. Finally, she nodded. Daniel spent the next 2 days photographing the locket from every angle, making sure he had clear images of the family photo inside. The woman Dewey Lout watched him work with a mixture of curiosity and anxiety. Through Pak Hassan's translation, she told him she had looked at that photo thousands of times over the years, trying to force her brain to remember something, anything. But the faces remained strangers to her, even though she knew one of them had to be her. Before leaving the island, Daniel promised he would do everything he could to find answers. He could see the hope in her eyes, but also fear. What if her past life was something terrible? What if there was a reason she had been out on the ocean that day? These questions hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. Back in his hotel room in the nearest town with internet access, Daniel began his search. He wasn't a professional investigator, but he knew how to research. He started by uploading the clearest photo of the locket image to his computer and enhancing it as much as he could. The faces were blurry and water-damaged, but you could still make out features and approximate ages. He tried reverse image searches first. Nothing came up. He searched for missing persons in Indonesia, narrowing it down to foreign nationals, then to women, then to the time frame of about 11 to 13 years ago. The databases were overwhelming. Hundreds of cases. Tourists who vanished, workers who never made it home, people who walked away from their lives for reasons known only to them. For 3 days, Daniel barely slept. He ordered room service and ate at his computer, scrolling through case after case. His eyes burned from staring at the screen. He was about to give up for the night when he decided to try one more search term: missing marine biologist Indonesia. The first result made his heart stop. It was a foundation website, the Anderson Family Foundation for Missing Persons. The page loaded slowly on his spotty internet connection. When the photo finally appeared, Daniel had to grab the edge of his desk. It was her. Older in his photographs, weathered by sun and time, but unmistakably the same person. Rebecca Anderson, age 28 when she disappeared. Marine biologist from Portland, Oregon, last seen on August 15th, 11 years ago, on a small uninhabited island during a family vacation. The website had been set up by her father and was dedicated to helping other families navigate the nightmare of having a loved one vanish. Daniel read everything on the site. There were photos of Rebecca from throughout her life. He could see her in the woman on Hidden Island, in the shape of her face, in the way she held herself. The website had a contact form, and Daniel stared at it for a long time before typing anything. How do you tell a family that their daughter might be alive? How do you give someone hope after 11 years when you might be wrong? Daniel had only spent a few hours with this woman. What if he was seeing what he wanted to see? What if this was some elaborate coincidence? But the locket, the location, the timing, it all fit too perfectly. He wrote the email 3 times before sending it. He tried to be careful with his words, not wanting to promise anything but needing them to know what he had found. He attached photos of the locket and a single picture of the woman, taken from a distance so her face was visible but not invasive. Then he hit send at 2 in the morning and immediately wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Tom Anderson was sitting at his computer in the foundation office when the email came in. He got dozens of emails a day, most of them from other families seeking advice or resources. He almost deleted Daniel's email thinking it was spam. The subject line read, "Urgent possible information about Rebecca Anderson." Tom had seen emails like this before. Well-meaning people who thought they had seen Rebecca in a crowd. Scam artists who wanted money in exchange for information. Once, someone had even sent a photo of a woman who looked nothing like his daughter, trying to convince him it was her so they could collect a reward. He opened the email anyway, the way he always did, because what if? The message was short and direct. A filmmaker in Indonesia, a woman living with a remote tribe. A locket with a photo. Tom clicked on the attachments with shaking hands. The locket appeared on his screen. Even tarnished and damaged, he recognized it instantly. He had been there when Helen gave it to Rebecca for her college graduation. Inside was a photo he had taken himself on a family trip to the coast when the kids were younger. The image was ruined by water damage, but he knew every detail of that picture. The second attachment loaded. A woman standing in a clearing, sun-dappled and distant. Tom leaned closer to the screen. His vision blurred with tears. He couldn't breathe. He tried to call Helen's name, but nothing came out except a choked sound. Helen heard him from the other room and came running. Tom, what's wrong?" He couldn't speak. He just pointed at the screen. Helen looked at the photos and her legs gave out. Tom caught her and they both sank to the floor holding each other, staring at the computer screen like it might disappear if they looked away. "Is that—" Helen couldn't finish the sentence. "I don't know," Tom said. But he did know. Somewhere deep in his bones, he knew. "I need to call Michael. We need to— I don't know what we need to do." They called Michael first. Then they called the U.S. Embassy in Indonesia. Then they called a lawyer. Then they sat together and read Daniel's email over and over, analyzing every word, looking at the photos until they had memorized every pixel. The next 48 hours were a blur. The embassy helped expedite everything. They contacted Indonesian authorities. They arranged for DNA specialists to travel to the island. Tom, Helen, and Michael booked the first flight they could get. Claire insisted on coming too, to help however she could. On the plane, none of them could sleep. Helen kept pulling up the photos on her phone, zooming in on the woman's face. "What if she doesn't remember us?" she whispered. "What if we're strangers to her?" "Then we start over," Tom said, though his voice shook. "We help her remember or we make new memories. I don't care. I just want her home." Michael sat across the aisle holding Claire's hand, staring out the window at the darkness. He kept thinking about that day on the beach, the day he should have watched his sister more carefully. For 11 years he had carried that guilt. Now maybe he would get a chance at forgiveness, even if it was only forgiving himself. When they landed in Indonesia, Daniel was waiting at the airport with Pak Hassan and a translator. The old man looked at the Anderson family with kind eyes. "Your daughter," he said through the translator. "She is safe. We have taken care of her. But you must understand she is not the same person you remember. The ocean took something from her and gave her back different." "I don't care," Helen said, tears streaming down her face. "Just take us to her, please." The boat ride to Hidden Island took 3 hours. The Anderson family stood at the bow, watching the blue water pass beneath them, each of them lost in their own thoughts about what they would find, what they would say, how you greet someone who is both your daughter and a stranger. The village appeared on the horizon like something from a dream, houses on stilts stretching across the water, children playing on wooden platforms, boats tied to posts swaying gently with the waves. Helen gripped Tom's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Michael stood behind them, one hand on his mother's shoulder, trying to prepare himself for whatever came next. Pak Hassan had sent word ahead that visitors were coming. When the boat pulled up to the village dock, a small crowd had gathered. The Bajo people watched with curiosity and something else, maybe protectiveness. This woman had been part of their community for 11 years. These strangers claiming to be her family were just that to them, strangers. Daniel led them through the village and up the path into the jungle. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were their footsteps on the dirt trail and the distant calls of tropical birds. Helen's mind was racing with everything she wanted to say, but every rehearsed speech evaporated in the thick, humid air. They reached the clearing and stopped. The house stood quiet in the dappled sunlight. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened and she stepped out. Helen made a sound that was half sob, half gasp. It was Rebecca. Older, so much older than the 28-year-old who had disappeared. Her skin was dark from the sun, her hair longer and lighter, her body lean and strong in a way it hadn't been before. She wore local clothing and moved with a different kind of grace, like someone completely at home in their environment. But it was her. It was their daughter, their sister, standing 20 feet away looking at them like they were people she was meeting for the first time. Because that's exactly what they were to her. Rebecca, or the woman who had been Rebecca, studied the 3 people staring at her with tears streaming down their faces. She looked at the older couple, at the young man about her age, trying to find some spark of recognition. The locket had shown her these faces. She knew intellectually that these were her family. But knowing and feeling are different things. Helen took a step forward. "Rebecca," Her voice broke on the name. The woman tilted her head slightly. Through the translator, she said, "They tell me that is my name. But I do not remember it. I do not remember you. I am sorry." Those words hit Helen like a physical blow, but she kept moving forward anyway. She stopped a few feet away, close enough to see her daughter's eyes. Those same blue-green eyes she had looked into the day Rebecca was born. "It's okay," Helen said, tears running down her cheeks. "It's okay that you don't remember. We're just so grateful you're alive." Tom came forward too, and Michael. They stood there, this family separated by memory but connected by blood, not knowing what to do next. Rebecca looked at each of them carefully, searching their faces. She reached up and touched her own cheek, then pointed at Helen. "You have the same eyes as me," she said through the translator. Helen laughed and cried at the same time. Yes, you have my eyes. The DNA test was just a formality. Everyone already knew the truth. But the results came back 3 days later, official and undeniable. This was Rebecca Anderson, missing for 11 years, somehow alive against all odds. Those 3 days on the island were strange and beautiful and heartbreaking. The Anderson family stayed in the guest house, and Rebecca would visit for a few hours each day. She was cautious at first, like a wild animal not sure if it should trust. But gradually she relaxed. Michael brought his phone and showed her photos of their childhood together. Rebecca looked at the images of a little girl and boy building sandcastles, riding bikes, opening Christmas presents. She could see that one of those children was her, but it felt like looking at someone else's life. Still, she kept asking to see more, studying each photo like it might unlock something in her damaged memory. Tom told her about her work as a marine biologist, about her passion for the ocean. Rebecca's eyes lit up at this. "I love the ocean," she said in careful English, the words coming slowly. "Here I dive with the bayou, I study the fish, the coral. I draw pictures of them." She showed him notebooks filled with detailed sketches of marine life. Tom held them with shaking hands, seeing his daughter's scientific mind still alive even without her memories. Helen just wanted to be near her. She would sit and watch Rebecca move around, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, the way she smiled at something funny. These small, familiar gestures from a person who was simultaneously her daughter and a stranger. The bigger question loomed over everything. What now? The U.S. Embassy made it clear that Rebecca was an American citizen. She could return to the United States. The Bayou community was devastated at the thought of losing her. Pak Hassan told the Andersons through tears that she had become like a granddaughter to him. The village children loved her. She was part of their world now, and Rebecca herself was torn. She sat on the beach one evening with her 2 families, biological and chosen, not knowing where she belonged. She spoke through the translator, her voice heavy with emotion. "This place saved my life. These people, they are my family. But you," she looked at Helen, Tom, and Michael, "you are also my family. I do not remember you, but I feel something here." She pressed her hand to her chest. "Like my heart knows you even if my mind does not." After many long discussions, they found a compromise. Rebecca would return to the United States, but not forever. She would go for treatment, to see if doctors could help her memory. She would spend time with the Anderson family, trying to rebuild connections, but she would also come back to Hidden Island regularly. She would maintain both lives, both families, both parts of herself. The day she left the island, the entire village came to say goodbye. Children cried and clung to her legs. The women gave her gifts to take with her. Pak Hassan held her hands and blessed her in his language, tears running down his weathered face. She promised she would return, and he nodded, believing her. On the plane to Portland, Rebecca sat between her parents. She held her mother's hand on one side and her father's on the other. Michael sat across from them with Claire. They were all exhausted, emotionally drained, but something like peace had settled over them. "What do I call you?" Rebecca asked Helen quietly. Helen looked at her daughter, this woman who was both familiar and new. "Whatever feels right to you," she said. "We have time to figure it out." The months that followed were difficult and wonderful. Rebecca underwent extensive medical evaluations. The doctors confirmed what everyone suspected. The head injury combined with trauma had caused severe retrograde amnesia. Her memories from before the accident might never fully return. But she was healthy, strong, and mentally sharp. She moved into a small apartment near her parents' house. Too much too fast would be overwhelming. She went to therapy 3 times a week. She started taking online courses in marine biology, finding that even though she couldn't remember her education, the knowledge was still there somehow, buried but accessible. Small moments of connection happened unexpectedly. A song on the radio made her cry without knowing why. Michael taught her to drive, and she instinctively knew how to parallel park. Helen made her childhood favorite dinner, and Rebecca ate it with tears streaming down her face, unable to explain why it made her feel safe. She video called Pak Hassan every week, speaking to him in the Bajo language, telling him about this strange new world of traffic lights and grocery stores and television. He would laugh and tell her news from the island. She bought a ticket to return for 3 months during the summer. A year after her return, Tom's foundation held a fundraiser. Rebecca stood at the podium and spoke to a room full of people who had lost loved ones. Her English was better now, though she still spoke with an accent that was part American, part something else entirely. "I cannot give you what you want most," she told them. "I cannot tell you that everyone who is lost will be found. But I can tell you this. Sometimes the ocean gives back what it takes. Sometimes people survive in ways we cannot imagine. Sometimes hope is not foolish. It is brave." The Anderson family sat in the front row, watching their daughter, who was not quite their daughter anymore, but was perhaps something more. She had lived 2 lives, survived the impossible, and become a bridge between 2 worlds. Helen leaned over and whispered to Tom, "We got her back." Tom squeezed her hand. "We got someone back. Someone new and somehow the same. Someone who taught us that love doesn't need memory to survive." Rebecca caught their eyes from the podium and smiled. It was a smile that belonged to both her lives, both her families, both her worlds. She was no longer the woman who disappeared 11 years ago, and she was no longer just Dewey Lout, the sea goddess. She was something unique, something that had been broken and rebuilt stronger. The island had kept her secret for 11 years, but when it finally spoke, it told a story not of loss but of survival, not of endings but of strange and beautiful new beginnings.